Hello everyone, this is Erik, the Asian movie enthusiast, and this is my review of Alienoid 2, Return to the Future, a Korean science fiction action movie from 2024 that is essentially a part 2 to the film Alienoid from 2022. Director Choi Dong-hoon returns. Now, as I mentioned in my first review of the first film, it's very difficult to briefly summarize the story, but I will try. The opening narration of the first film says that, for ages, aliens locked up their prisoners in human bodies, but humans were not aware of this. Sometimes prisoners escaped the human bodies, and they called these acts breakouts. Now, the story takes place in multiple time periods, primarily the modern day and the 1300s. It revolves around a handful of characters, one of whom is an alien in human form, who monitors and catches other aliens who attempt to break out of their human bodies. There's also a little human girl who the alien adopted after a prior breakout event, and in a nutshell, we see how these different breakout events impact a handful of characters from both time periods. Now, Alienoid 2 begins with a short recap of its predecessor. Almost all of the characters return here, even the goofy alchemists and who have those crazy magical abilities, and there are some new side characters that are introduced as well. Now, the opening act of this film takes place in the 1300s, and then events shift to the present day, and then after that it keeps bouncing back and forth. And that bouncing back and forth is very consistent with the structure of the first film. I will say this though, Alienoid 2 has a good number of flashbacks that show different perspectives of scenes from the first film. So the purpose of this is to kind of gain additional context and reveal things you did not know were happening off screen during the events of Alienoid. Now, I've always enjoyed this kind of storytelling. There was a Japanese film called Stranger in Mind that did this, a Korean romantic comedy called Couples that did this, and I've always liked it because it gives events a new spin, adds depth to the narrative, and fills in some gaps in the story and stuff like that. I don't think Alienoid 2 is quite as exceptionally written as those prior films that I mentioned, but it does have some of those positives to having a structure like this. Now, on the negative side, I do feel like Alienoid 2 feels like it's retreading some old ground for some of the opening half because of the structure it adopted. You're like seeing scenes replayed again, and then you're seeing different kind of angles and different things happening around those scenes. So, parts of Act 2 in this film in particular did feel a little bit slow because of this. It does avoid having any serious pacing issues, but I do think the sequel does drag a little bit during the second act. Thankfully, I do think the story does cash in on that patience with some very neat plot turns that are effectively interesting. Another observation in regard to the script is that there are a few contrivances and coincidences that they chuck in, but they're all in good fun. I mean, this is a crazy science fiction action comedy, really, so I was okay with them. So both of these movies, Alienoid 1 and 2, were shot at the same time. So we do have a consistency of all the actors, basically, that return. So Joon-yeol and Kim Woo-bin return, as well as Tae-ri. And those are basically our three co-leads, in a sense. I'm a big fan of Tae-ri, I've said multiple times on this channel, and she has more of a consistently important role in this sequel, which is very nice. And all of the cast delivers, including the supporting actors. The tone in this one is pretty light for the most part. There are a number of humorous moments. I do think that the comedy in this sequel is a little bit better executed. It's a bit more successful at kind of pulling out the laughs from you. So I did think that was an improvement over its predecessor. Now, in terms of the action, the biggest action set pieces are basically backloaded into the final act of the film. And it's basically like a huge two-part finale, which begins on a moving train, and then it moves to like the decisive battle. But during the first two-thirds of the movie, there are a bunch of like shorter scuffles and confrontations that are thrown in. You know, fights that emphasize bladed weapons and magic. But they're not really huge set pieces. You don't really get that feel until the final act. So I do think that the distribution of the action is a little bit inconsistent in this film, but the finale is satisfying. So in terms of like the design of the action, you get that refreshingly creative blend of the first film. And I mentioned that in my review of Alienoid. You get this bizarre mix of elements within each action sequence. You get magic, modern technology, future technology, characters from different time periods interacting with one another in ways. Like you'll get old school traditional weaponry that's mixed in with magic and future weaponry. And it's pretty cool, you know? And I'm happy to report that that sense of creativity does return in the sequel. So that's good. So I would say, in terms of Alienoid 2, I definitely recommend it. I do think I prefer the original film slightly more, just because of, I think it was just, the pacing in this sequel was just a little bit flat during that second act. But I enjoyed this quite a bit, and I will be adding it to my personal collection. I think this is a good, solid 2-part action sci-fi flick with a good dose of comedy. I think there's a lot to enjoy in these. So I do think you need to watch both films within like a few days of one another, because a lot of scenes kind of interact between the films. So you'll need to have the first film fresh in your mind when you watch the sequel. So yes, I recommend this. It's currently available streaming on YouTube, and I believe it's scheduled for a Blu-ray release in the United States. And as always, folks, I'll see you next time.